Some people are born into medals, others fall into silence. I came from both, but only one left a scar. I'm Grace Emerson, 31, former lieutenant in the United States Special Forces. But before I ever earned a title that made people say my name out loud, I was just the quiet blur in the background. The pause no one noticed. The space between my family's sentences. If you really want to know what it feels like to disappear without ever leaving the room, you'd have to start at my parents' dinner table where silence was an absence. It was how we communicated, where praise only had one direction, and I was always sitting on the wrong side of it. You learn pretty quickly in a house like that. Being quiet doesn't keep you safe, but it keeps you out of the way. My father was a retired Navy commander, a man who wore authority like a second skin. Discipline rank results, that's what he understood. Emotions were distractions, tenderness was weakness. My mother, a former combat medic, had hands made for stitching wounds, but not for holding warmth. She existed in muted tones, always on the periphery of her own life. And then there was Nathan, my older brother, the golden son, the echo of everything my father once was, and everything he wished to be again. Nathan didn't just arrive in the world first. He absorbed all the light. First to walk, first to speak, first to win, first to wear a uniform that turned admiration into tradition. Me, I wasn't second, I was background noise. Even my report cards felt like static in a house wired for Nathan's headlines. Growing up, every hallway was a monument to him. Plaques from science fairs framed newspaper clippings of his track victories, and later photographs of him in uniform beside my father, both in crisp dress blues mirroring each other in posture and pride. I used to stare at those photos not out of jealousy, but to remind myself that I existed in the same house, that I shared their last name, that I wasn't just a guest passing through the shadow of greatness. My childhood room had no trophies, just shelves lined with books, old sketch pads, a single certificate from a writing contest in 8th grade 1, my parents never remembered to frame. So, when I came home on a rare leave, that fall still sore from the last mission, still reeling from the adrenaline of getting a whole unit out of hostile terrain, with no casualties, I thought maybe this time they'd see me. I pressed my uniform, straightened my insignia, even tied my hair up the way my father used to bark it to look respectable. I arrived early, stood on the front porch for a moment, just breathing, trying to shake off the weight of being Grace the soldier, and not just Grace, the invisible daughter. At dinner, I spoke. We wrapped the op early. 0 injuries, high extraction zone. My voice didn't shake, but it may as well have. My father kept cutting into his roast, not bothering to glance up. Combat support isn't real war, he said the way someone might dismiss a weather report. I sat straighter. We were the lead unit, I said. We went in first. Nathan leaned back in his chair, smirking. Still crawling through dirt with a flashlight and a map. That's adorable. My mother didn't look at me. She passed the gravy boat across the table directly into Nathan's waiting hand. That's nice, Grace, she said, with a tone reserved for schoolchildren and distant cousins. My father cleared his throat. Your brother's up for Delta Tactical next quarter. Now that's real leadership. Nathan shrugged, like modesty was just another thing he wore well. Hey, Grace is trying. Not everyone's made for medals. They chuckled. Just enough for it to sting. Not enough for anyone to admit it was cruelty. That table always felt like a battlefield, only no one ever called it that. No uniforms, no weapons, just knives of a different kind. Their words didn't bleed me not right away. They carved slower like rust creeping into the bones of a house. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell them how I'd mapped that mission from scratch, how I'd carried 2 men through fire, while the intel Nathan relied on came from the boots I wore through the dirt. But silence was safer. In this house, my voice had always been a misfire, too soft, too inconvenient, too late. Nathan didn't have to lie to look bigger. All he had to do was laugh while they looked the other way. And me, I learned to measure my worth in pauses, in what they didn't ask, in how quickly they moved on after the one thing I offered in the conversation. They didn't raise me to disappear, but they trained me to shrink, and I got good at it. But that night, something shifted. Not in them, in me. A voice low and steady, somewhere deep under the bruises. You're not here to convince them. You're here to outgrow them. And right there, in that half-lit dining room, with the scrape of silverware cutting through a silence too practiced to be accidental, I swallowed the oldest truth in our family. Praise had a direction, and it never turned my way. My plate was full, untouched. But I wasn't hungry. I never was not here. Around me, the noise picked up Nathan's training schedule, how his COs admired his command presence, how Dad beamed every time his name came up. I stared at the napkin in my lap and wondered if I could just fold myself into it small enough to slip between the cracks in their conversation. I didn't say another word that night. I didn't need to. The heat in my chest cooled slow and sharp until it hardened into something colder than anger. As dinner ended, Nathan pulled out his phone. A video. Him giving orders during a drill, his voice full of the certainty that always seemed to come naturally to him. My father watched like he was reliving a better version of himself. Look at that form, he said. That's Emerson blood. But he wasn't talking about me. My mother, eyes shining with pride, whispered, "You're going to make general someday." It wasn't a wish. It was a prophecy. I stood slow and quiet. No one looked up. I cleared my plate, took it to the sink, and lingered just long enough for someone to notice, just long enough to hope. Nothing. So I slipped out the back door into the dark, sat on the steps, hands clenched, head tilted toward a sky that didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. It wasn't rage I carried. It wasn't sorrow either. It was the kind of silence that doesn't break its suit, wraps around your throat until even the desire to be heard fades into a whisper you stop believing in. That was the last dinner I ever attended as their daughter. After that, I became something else, not rebellious, not resentful, just gone. They didn't raise me to disappear, but they built a house where invisibility felt safer than being wrong. And slowly I learned how to vanish without making a sound, without leaving a trace. Gracefully, even. There was only one person who ever seemed to notice the space I occupied, like she was watching for the parts of the room others skipped over. Ellie Monroe, my cousin, younger by 3 years, quieter by instinct. She came to our house most weekends growing up, trailing behind her parents, always half hiding behind a book or a too big sweater. But her eyes missed nothing. Ellie never raised her voice for me. She wasn't bold, never interrupted, never challenged the script at those dinners. But in her quiet, watchful way, she saw me. And sometimes being seen by one person is all it takes to keep breathing. Still, her gaze wasn't powerful enough to tilt a world forever leaning in Nathan's favor. At school, teachers would spot my last name and smile. "Are you related to Nathan Emerson?" I'd nod. Their faces lit up. He was brilliant, one of the finest cadets we've ever had. No one asked who I was. What was I like? No one thought to. After a while, I stopped correcting them. I started to disappear not just at home, but everywhere. I sat in the back row, turned in papers early, never spoke unless absolutely necessary. Praise made me uneasy. It felt foreign, untrustworthy. Because if my own parents couldn't see me, what made anyone else's words real, I remember one afternoon in high school. I'd been selected to represent our state in a National Youth Leadership Summit in DC, a highly competitive honour. I brought home the acceptance letter, printed neatly on cream paper with an embossed seal. I laid it carefully on the kitchen counter, where my father usually reviewed our mail. That night during dinner, no one mentioned it. Not a word, not even a glance. Instead, they talked about Nathan's ROTC field training results. He'd placed first in his platoon. Again. After everyone had gone to bed, I checked the counter. The letter was still there, unopened. I folded it and tucked it into my journal. That was the night I realised something permanent. You could scream in a house like ours without ever making a sound. Ellie had been there that weekend. She must have noticed the letter too, because the next day she slipped me a small note written on lined paper. All it said was, "I saw it. You deserved it. I'm proud of you." I kept that note taped to the inside of my locker for the rest of the year. Looking back, I realised Ellie represented the kind of person I wished I could be for myself. Quiet, yes, but certain. She didn't fight the current, but she never drowned in it either. She floated. I admired that more than I ever told her. My relationship with Nathan was more complicated. On good days, he was charming, protective even. He'd help me with physics problems or toss me an extra slice of pizza when Dad wasn't looking. On bad days, he'd remind me how small I was, not cruelly, but with the confidence of someone who'd never been made to question his own importance. "Grace, some people lead, some follow. You're good at support," he once said, when I told him I was thinking of applying to the same academy he did. "Doesn't mean you're not valuable, just different." I laughed it off, but I never replied. That conversation sat in my chest like a stone for years. Sometimes I wonder how many decisions I made, just to avoid proving them right, or worse, proving myself wrong. I took the quieter path not because I lacked ambition, but because ambition without permission felt like betrayal in our house. You didn't dream too loud unless you had the medals to back it up. And if you were like me, cautious, methodical, good at listening instead of shouting, you learned to find pride in being overlooked. There was one night during my junior year when I almost quit everything. I'd stayed up late working on a research project for a scholarship I desperately wanted. Hours of writing, revising, and compiling data. My laptop died before I could save the final version. I stared at the blank screen for 20 minutes, tears pooling but refusing to fall. I was so used to no one caring that I nearly convinced myself the work didn't matter. Then, Ellie texted me out of nowhere. Just a simple line, "If you give up, they win." I don't know how she knew, but that message brought me back to the screen. I started again. I didn't get that scholarship, but I finished the project. And when the certificate of participation arrived in the mail, I pinned it to my wall, not because anyone else would see it, but because I needed proof that I had finished something, that I hadn't disappeared entirely. That's how my childhood moved one invisible milestone after another. I built a quiet kind of excellence, one that didn't demand attention but couldn't be dismissed either. I learned to find power in planning, in subtlety, in noticing things others missed. I sharpened my instincts not because I wanted to be the best, but because I didn't want to vanish completely. And, slowly, unknowingly, I became the kind of person who could lead in silence, who could carry weight without needing applause. I didn't know then that those skills would one day save lives. I just knew they were all I had. When I enlisted in the military, everyone assumed it was because of Nathan. Some even called it predictable, like I was trying to live in his shadow on purpose. But they were wrong. I didn't enlist to follow him. I enlisted to find something that didn't already belong to him. A space, a title, a purpose that bore my name alone. I chose the path he never would have picked, Special Forces Recon. Not because it sounded heroic, but because it was the kind of job where you weren't rewarded for being loud, you were rewarded for being right. I wasn't interested in glory. I was interested in precision, in doing the work nobody saw, but everyone depended on. I learned how to move through forests and city ruins like a ghost, how to read terrain like a language, how to make choices under pressure so crushing it made bones ache. I learned to lead not by barking orders, but by proving again and again that when everything fell apart, I was the one who kept people breathing. I didn't light up rooms, but I kept teams alive. My first year was a series of small, hard-won victories. I was underestimated constantly, too quiet, too controlled, too female. But my COs noticed. They saw how my reports were always the most thorough, how my routes led to fewer injuries, how my decisions under fire came without panic. I rose slowly but steadily. No shortcuts, no favours. My file grew thick with commendations that never made it onto my family's fridge. Every time I was deployed, I sent my parents an update. Most times I got a reply like, "Stay safe." "Nathan's got a new team under him, can you believe it?" Or sometimes nothing at all. One summer, I came back from a 6-month deployment in one of the most volatile zones in the Middle East. Our unit had located and extracted intel that shifted an entire operation. My name was in the after-action report. I had 3 weeks of leave and spent the first 2 trying to catch my breath, then decided against instinct to visit home. The house looked the same down to the picture frames lining the hallway. Except now, the wall I used to call Nathan's wing had grown. A new row of medals, a certificate from a command leadership seminar, and a framed magazine cover featuring his profile. I scanned the hallway slowly, looking for even a sliver of myself. Not one photo. Not one mention. I'd sent them my formal portrait in full dress uniform a year ago. It never made it out of the envelope. That night, over dinner, they asked me one question about my work. "So, you're still in recon?" my father said between bites. "You ever think of moving into something bigger?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew they wouldn't land anywhere. My mother chimed in. "Nathan just got tapped to lead a multi-unit training initiative. It's a big deal." I nodded. "That's great," I said, and I meant it because I'd stopped confusing acknowledgement with rivalry a long time ago. But I also felt myself folding inward again like I always did under that roof. I went upstairs that night to the guest room, they didn't call it mine anymore, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly. There was no banner, no welcome home sign, no warmth that said, "We're glad you're here." Just a quiet house filled with someone else's echo. That was when I realised the worst kind of invisibility doesn't come from being ignored. It comes from being seen, but only through someone else's outline. At some point, I had become the negative space around Nathan's glory, the missing part of the photograph. And I had to learn how to live with that absence, like it was its own kind of presence. Then came the deployment that changed everything, the one where absence turned into consequence. We were assigned to the same region for the first time. Different units, different missions, but overlapping territory. I was leading a recon team tasked with terrain surveillance and forward intel on insurgent patterns along a ridge that had gone quiet for too long. Nathan had just been promoted to regional strategy liaison. He walked into the joint briefing like he already owned the map. I was seated near the back, scribbling down timings, coordinates, and satellite pass estimates. He entered mid-discussion, and without skipping a beat, smiled and said Lieutenant Emerson like it was a private joke. Captain, I replied steady. Professional? Detached? Still sneaking through brush and mud? Huh. He quipped after the meeting, his tone playful but biting. Some of us lead from the front, I said, eyes locked. He laughed and patted my back a little too hard. One day, you'll run a real op. It didn't take long for the clash to begin. The op was simple on paper: observe a suspected compound, gather intel, engage only if absolutely necessary. We had a satellite pass scheduled at 0145, vital for thermal confirmation. I planned every detail like I always did: fallback routes, timing windows, signal check-ins, med-evac contingency. But Nathan wasn't interested in patience. Why wait till 0145, he asked during our coordination brief. We move. Now we catch them while they're still sleeping. I pointed to the satellite path overlay. If we go in blind, we lose real-time visual. We can't verify movement or secondary exits. He shrugged. Sometimes speed is the intel. I paused. You're not the one on the ground. He smiled like I'd complimented him. Exactly. Somehow, still unclear to this day, his recommendation made it through to higher command. Maybe he pulled strings. Maybe he made a convincing case in some closed-door meeting. Either way, the mission was green-lit early. I didn't argue again. Maybe I should have. Maybe that's the moment I'll always return to in my sleep, wondering if a louder voice could have bought us 3 more hours and 2 fewer deaths. We deployed at 22:30 under a clouded moon visibility, thin terrain thick with brush and silence that felt rehearsed. I led the team in 3 units, staggered positions and minimal noise. Every nerve in me hummed with something sharp, something wrong. It was too quiet. The compound looked still, but not abandoned like it was waiting. A flicker, a shadow, a glint of metal. I barely had time to signal halt before the first blast went off. Tripwire, then another. Remote detonations. Someone knew we were coming, and exactly when. Corporal Ellis was thrown 10 feet, hit a tree, and didn't move again. Communication scrambled. Extraction delayed. 1 evac bird took fire and had to abort landing. I pulled 2 men out of a collapsed trench with bare hands, while rounds cracked through the trees. We lost 2. 5 wounded, including me. I don't remember how I got out, only the taste of blood and mud, and the burn in my chest when the adrenaline finally wore off and the guilt took its place. The debrief was clinical. 3 officers. 1 silent observer. Tape recorder. No warmth, no names, just timestamps and accountability. Lieutenant Emerson, why did you authorize early movement? The window was updated by command, I answered. Who updated it? There was a pause. Saying Nathan's name didn't feel right. It wouldn't change what happened. Captain Emerson, I said eventually. The pause that followed felt like a vacuum. What operational authority did he have over your decision-making? None, I admitted. And that was it. The hook was set. Grace Emerson mission lead. Grace Emerson final call. Grace Emerson suspended for tactical misjudgment, pending further review. Nathan didn't attend the inquiry. He sent a statement. 2 paragraphs. Vague references to joint pressures and discretionary judgment. No mention of our conversation. No ownership of the suggestion. No word to me. Not even a text. I didn't even have time to clear my bunk before word spread through the barracks. People didn't say much, just a few glances, the kind that hover somewhere between pity and relief that it wasn't them. Some of the younger recruits wouldn't look me in the eye at all. A few of the older ones, the ones I'd led into fire and out again, offered the briefest nods. No one asked what really happened. No one said, "We know it wasn't all you." In the military, silence can be a strategy, but sometimes it's just survival. When a name falls from grace, people step back like it's contagious. They said it was pending review, but we all knew what that meant. It was a quiet exile. I wasn't kicked out, but I wasn't trusted anymore. I was a liability wrapped in uniform. Even the way they handed me the report felt rehearsed, like they'd already filed it away before I signed it. There's a particular kind of shame that settles in your bones when you're told not directly, but unmistakably, that you are no longer useful. The flight home was quiet. I stared out the window most of the way, watching clouds drift like soldiers in retreat. I tried not to replay the mission, but my brain wouldn't stop looping it. Ellis's body, the radio static, the burning metal smell, the moment I gave the green light. I kept thinking, maybe if I'd spoken louder, maybe if I'd gone over Nathan's head, but that's not how it worked, not in a place where his name opened doors and mine just knocked politely. Landing in my hometown felt like stepping into a dream I'd outgrown. The streets were smaller, the light harsher, the air thick with old expectations. As I pulled into the driveway, a neighbour waved from across the street, then stopped when she saw my face. She turned back to her garden like she hadn't noticed me at all. Inside, nothing had changed. Same carpet, same humming refrigerator, same photo of Nathan in full dress uniform on the mantel, now joined by a newer one, him shaking hands with a general. My father was in his chair, as always polishing his glasses like they were something sacred. When he looked up and saw me, there was no hug, no welcome, just the same cold nod he gave distant relatives at funerals. "You made a bad call," he said. 4 words, final words. I stayed standing. "I didn't make it alone," I said. My voice didn't shake. "Not yet." "You were in charge," he replied, like it settled everything. Later that evening, I found my mother alone in the kitchen, slicing apples into a bowl like she was preparing for guests who'd never arrive. I stood at the counter watching her hands. "Do you believe me?" I asked. She didn't look up. "It's complicated, Grace." Her voice was soft, but it landed like a stone in water. "You always said you wanted to serve." "Well, not all service ends in medals." She slid the bowl toward the centre of the counter and walked away without another word. I stared at the apples. I wasn't hungry. That night, I sat in the old twin bed in the room they now called the spare. I stared at the same ceiling I had stared at as a girl counting shadows between the fan blades, hoping that someday someone would open the door and say, "We're proud of you, too." No one came. And then, in the morning, the envelope. My name is in my mother's cursive like that detail might soften the rest. Inside, Nathan's promotion ceremony invitation. Location, time, dress code. No personal note. No acknowledgement that I might feel anything beyond obligation. The audacity of it asking me to watch the same people who erased me celebrate the one who let me burn. But still, I didn't throw it away. I folded the letter back into the envelope and held it in my hands like it weighed more than it should. Something inside me, a mix of pain, pride, and a desperate whisper of hope, told me to go. Maybe part of me still longed to be seen, or maybe I just wanted to prove I still existed. I got up that morning before sunrise the way I used to before missions, not because I needed time, but because my body remembered the rhythm of days where appearances meant survival. I laid out my uniform on the bed like it was a second skin I hadn't worn in years. The jacket still fit. The medals still shone. The boots still knew how to hold my weight. I ironed every crease, pinned every insignia. I even tucked a strand of hair behind my ear the way my father once insisted looked sharp. Some part of me, against every bitter instinct, still wanted to believe this day might offer a sliver of repair. I drove the 2 hours to the city in silence. No music, just the hum of highway lines passing beneath tires. I told myself I wouldn't expect anything, but as I parked outside the grand event hall, that lie started to crack. It was the kind of place with stone columns, military banners fluttering above the doors, and security officers standing in crisp formation. A line of guests stretched near the entrance, decorated officers, family members, and dignitaries. I adjusted my jacket, felt the stiffness of my posture return, and stepped forward. "Name," the young officer at the gate asked, eyes still on his clipboard. "Lieutenant Grace Emerson." He flipped a page, frowned, scanned again, then looked up, unsure. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. You're not on the guest list." I blinked, once my face unreadable. "That's not possible. I have the invitation." I pulled it from my inside pocket, still crisp, still untouched by affection. He took it, glanced at the details, then handed it back with an awkward half-smile. "You weren't included in the official registry. I can't admit anyone who's not cleared." Behind him, just beyond the glass doors, I saw them. My mother, in her navy blue dress, was laughing too loudly at something my aunt had said. My father, chest-puffed, standing near a podium, where Nathan's name was displayed on a screen in block letters, Major Nathan Emerson. Leadership Honours. He stood at the centre of it, all shaking hands surrounded by pride and applause. Cameras flashed, waiters passed out champagne. No one looked at the entrance. No one noticed me. Then, a flicker, someone I recognised from my old unit, a lieutenant I'd briefed before an op in Kandahar. He caught sight of me for half a second. Our eyes locked, and then he turned away. Just like that. I nodded slowly. "It's fine," I said to the officer, calm as winter. "Forget it." I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I simply vanished. That night, back in my apartment, 3 states away, I stood in front of the mirror in full dress uniform. I studied myself not as a soldier, not as a daughter, but as a ghost who had once belonged to a world that forgot her. Then, without ceremony, I unpinned each medal, each bar, each sign of service. I placed them in a box. I folded the jacket with precision. I tucked the name patch inside, last. I placed the box in the closet, shut the door, and turned off the light. For months after I lived without a uniform, without calls, without sound, I worked odd jobs, taught wilderness survival at a summer program for teenagers who thought danger was a dead phone battery. I ran every morning before sunrise, not because I had to, but because it was the only time my lungs felt real. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I deleted every photo from my phone that had family in it. I wasn't erasing history. I was clearing space for breath. Some people disappear dramatically, burning bridges, slamming doors. I didn't. I simply stopped showing up to the places where I was never welcome. There's a kind of power in choosing to vanish before someone else decides to erase you. There's a kind of power in choosing to vanish before someone else decides to erase you. But even in vanishing, some things refuse to stay buried, like a letter. It arrived, folded between bills and coupons, a pale blue envelope with my name handwritten in the corner, like a whisper only I was meant to hear. The handwriting pulled me back to childhood summers. Ellie Monroe, my cousin, the only person who ever asked if I was okay without needing a reason. I opened the envelope with a kind of reverence. The letter wasn't long, just a dozen lines. "Grace," it began. "I don't know where you are. I hope you're still you. I know I never said it out loud, but I saw what happened. I saw what they did. I believe you. I always did." I sat down on the floor. Not a chair, not the couch. The floor. Because grief hits you in the knees before it touches your heart. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting the truth in her words fill all the empty rooms inside me that my family had closed. That night, I pulled the plastic storage bin from under my bed, the one with old recon maps, mission logs, USB drives and field journals no one ever asked about. I hadn't touched it in months. Opening it felt like cracking open a vault sealed by shame. I laid out the contents across the floor like I was setting a table for ghosts. The recon reports were precise, just like I'd been trained. No drama, just a fact. That's what made the deviation so obvious. My original plan for the mission, confirmed by timestamped documents, had been clean insertion at 0:01:45 hours, following satellite recon. The plan we executed 22:30, almost 5 hours earlier. The change had no official authorization, no email from command, just a note on a revised document, adjusted timing per strategic advisory. That advisory, as I found buried deep in an off-record message thread, was from Nathan. A message to the logistics officer read, "She'll hesitate, but I've overridden the delay. We strike early, I'll take responsibility if it backfires." But he hadn't. I had. The message ended with a damn smiley face. I stared at it longer than I stared at the casualty report. That symbol was what betrayal looked like when it was dressed in familiarity. I kept digging. through archived access logs, meeting schedules, satellite pass authorizations. Every breadcrumb confirmed what I already knew: the timing had been manipulated. Nathan had circumvented protocol, acted without clearance, and disappeared behind vague phrases when it all fell apart. I could have stopped there. I could have folded the files back into the box, sealed them up, and buried them under my bed again. Part of me wanted to. Reporting this would mean officially going after my brother, not just in name, but in legacy, in truth. And the military doesn't handle grey lines well, especially not when they're stained with family ties. I didn't sleep that night. I reread Ellie's letter at least 10 times. That one sentence I believe you looped in my head like a mantra and a challenge. I knew I had a choice. Stay silent, keep fading, or say something no one wanted to hear. I opened a new document, started compiling. Data first, screenshots, chat logs, deployment orders, timeline discrepancies, names redacted for privacy but not Nathan's. I included every note, every log, every subtle manipulation. It took 3 days. I ate maybe twice, barely spoke. My world narrowed to one mission: tell the truth, not for vengeance, but for the record. When I finished, I drafted a single line at the top of the report. This is not retaliation, it is correct. Then I printed a hard copy, encrypted a digital version, and mailed both to the Office of Military Ethics without a return address. The moment the green light blinked on the confirmation screen, I exhaled. Not with relief, with certainty. I wasn't erasing Nathan. I was removing the lie that had erased me. The next few days passed like walking through fog, not heavy, just thick enough that I kept bumping into the fact that I'd finally done it. The report was gone. Out of my hands, out of hiding. The silence that had once defined me had been broken, and I wasn't sure yet what sound would replace it. On the 5th morning, I received a secure email from the Office of Military Ethics. Subject line, follow-up, regarding recent submission. I didn't click it immediately. I walked around. My apartment, made coffee, sat down and stood back up. My fingers hovered over the mouse like it might bite. When I opened it, the message was short, clinical. Lieutenant Grace Emerson, your report has been reviewed and substantiated. Official records reflect procedural discrepancies during Operation Iron Mantle. Disciplinary action is hereby voided. All reprimands expunged. Reinstatement eligible, effective immediately. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been taken from me. Just redacted lines protocol language and 2 words that made me blink: status cleared. I reread it until the words lost meaning. Then I whispered them aloud. Not to believe them, but to own them. Status cleared. It sounded like being let back into a room you were never supposed to be locked out of. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like accuracy. That afternoon, I got a call from Colonel Rhodes, an old mentor from my earliest deployments. His voice still had the weight of gravel and salt. Grace, he said, dropping the formality. I've seen the review. I'm calling because we need someone like you back. And I don't just mean your tactics, I mean your spine. I let the words sit. I hadn't heard my name spoken like that without suspicion or softness in a long time. I'm not looking for redemption, I replied. Good, he said. We're not offering any. We're offering the job you should have never been removed from. 2 weeks later, I walked back onto base. It was surreal stepping onto familiar ground, with unfamiliar weight in my chest. The gate guard gave a crisp nod. My ID badge scanned green. I walked past the offices where whispers used to follow me. Now they nodded. Quiet, respectful, curious, maybe even cautious. I didn't care. I wasn't there for applause. I was there to work. My quarters had been reassigned. Same layout, different view. This time facing the runway. The sounds of aircraft of preparation and movement filled the space where shame used to live. On the desk lay a mission folder, Operation Archway. Primary Objective Command Lead, Major Grace Emerson, Major. I stared at the rank for a while. I had earned it once and lost it without a trial. Now it had come not as a favour, but as a correction. No one said it, but I could feel it in the way Rhodes spoke to me. I wasn't being welcomed back, I was being restored. That night, I suited up again, pulled on the uniform I had once folded away like a funeral flag. The fabric felt tighter, not in size, but in gravity, like it had waited for me to return with something more than skill, with truth. Just before lights out, I checked the mailroom. One envelope, handwritten, from Ellie. Grace, it read. I saw the reinstatement. I don't have the words yet. But I want you to know, watching you stand gave me the courage to speak. To someone. Anyone. I'm not silent anymore, because you weren't. I folded the letter slowly, pressed it against my chest. I wasn't home, but I wasn't lost anymore either. I folded the letter slowly, pressed it against my chest. I wasn't home, but I wasn't lost anymore either. My first mission back wasn't heroic. No high-stakes infiltration, no last-minute evacuations, just a logistics op for a humanitarian drop zone, calculated, quiet, necessary. And in some ways, that made it perfect. Something was healing about beginning again, not with fanfare, but with function. The team was mostly new faces. A few were younger than I was when I first wore the patch. They didn't ask about the rumours. They didn't mention my name with curiosity or caution. They just watched how I moved, how I read terrain, how I didn't need to raise my voice to shift an entire squad's direction. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it builds in silence, one executed plan at a time. Over the next several months, my name began to show up again in reports, in after-action briefings, in quiet praise passed between commanding officers. Efficient under pressure. Discretionary brilliance. Command trust high. No one said the word redemption, but I felt it lingering in the spaces where skepticism used to live. I didn't reach out to my family. I didn't need to. I wasn't building bridges, I was constructing something new entirely. And this time, it had nothing to do with being allowed in. I made sure every operation I led left no room for doubt. The silence that once wounded me had become my sharpest tool. I didn't fill the rooms. I focused on them. It was during a debrief at a regional training base when I saw her. Ellie. She sat quietly in the back row, hair tucked into a soft knot, eyes trained on me like I was reading aloud, the story she'd memorised but never heard told. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. But after everyone left, I found a folded note slipped under my tablet. Grace, it said, "You don't know this yet, but today was a beginning for me too. I've enrolled in officer candidate school. I want to serve, not to follow anyone's footsteps, but to carve my own. Watching you reclaim your name didn't just give me hope. It gave me permission. You've returned, and I'm learning to stand too." I closed my eyes and held the letter for a long time. This wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about seeing others. Grace used to mean small, quiet, and meek. But I was learning grace could also mean fierce, still certain. I had reappeared, not because someone allowed me to, but because I had never truly left. It was during a monthly briefing that I first saw the remnants of the world that had once erased me. The room was smaller than the auditoriums I used to enter, with lowered eyes, but no less heavy. As I stepped toward my seat, I caught a glimpse of the leadership wall, a series of framed photographs, highlighting decorated officers who had completed distinguished command tours. One photo in particular stopped me cold. Nathan, clean-cut, decorated mid-speech at a podium, framed under the words, "exemplary leadership." It was from 2 years before Iron Mantle. I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel grief, just recognition. That photo wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole story, and I had stopped expecting the world to tell mine for me. I looked away before anyone noticed. Later that week, during a joint drill, I saw a young female corporal being reprimanded on the tarmac. Her boots weren't laced correctly, apparently. A senior officer barked at her in front of everyone. The girl's stiffened eyes locked forward, the humiliation burning down her neck. I felt my own spine go rigid, remembering. Not the laces, but the tone. The public correction was meant to assert control. It wasn't abuse. It was culture. The kind that punishes quietly and rewards louder men for lesser errors. After the drill, I caught up to her by the gear lockers. I didn't coddle. I didn't undermine the chain of command. I just said, your worth doesn't begin with perfection. It begins when you show up again tomorrow. Her eyes welled, but she didn't let them fall. She nodded once. That was enough. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd kept locked in my bottom drawer since reinstatement. I hadn't touched it for months, maybe out of fear that writing would reopen wounds I'd only just started stitching. I flipped to a blank page. I returned without permission, I wrote. I returned, not for them, not for vindication, not even for justice. I returned because the silence I carried turned into a voice too heavy to keep inside. And that voice, my own, is how I lead now. Not with anger, not with apology, with truth. I paused, then added, and the truth doesn't whisper anymore. I stared at my own handwriting in the journal, then slowly closed the cover. It was the first time I'd written truth without thinking of it as a battlefield. For so long, truth had been something I fought to prove evidence, to build voices, to convince. But now it had become something else. A compass. Silent, unshakable, and always pointing me back to myself. A few days later, during an off-duty rotation, I wandered into the base library, mostly out of habit. A quiet space, a familiar smell of dust and age. As I ran my fingers across the spines of manuals and mission biographies, I came across a small exhibit on women in leadership. There were plaques and clippings, mostly surface level, but one caught my eye, an anonymous quote typed in bold under the image of a female colonel. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. I stood there longer than I meant to, letting those words settle under my skin, like armor I hadn't realized I needed. That line wasn't about me, but it felt like it had been waiting for someone like me to read it. I snapped a photo and set it as the background of my communications device, not for inspiration, for grounding. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, I stood again at the edge of the compound. Same spot, same breathless wind, and for the first time since I'd returned, I allowed myself to wonder, had I really made it back, or had I simply made peace with never needing to? Either way, I wasn't invisible anymore. The email arrived on a Tuesday, military header, encrypted official. Subject 75th. Anniversary of Joint Tactical Command honorary roster and schedule. I almost deleted it, assuming it was a mass list or logistics memo. But when I opened the attachment, my name wasn't buried on page 5 or tucked into a footnote. It was the first thing on the list. Major Grace Emerson Lead honoree. My eyes scanned the rest of the page in a daze. Guest speakers, medal commendations, panel topics. Then, further down in the RSVP section, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Emerson, followed by retired Commander Frank Emerson and Nurse Captain Marilyn Emerson. My whole family. Invited, confirmed. I leaned back in my chair, letting the screen glow against my face, like it might explain the irony. After all the closed doors, the paper-thin silences, the erased dinners and unspoken truths, my name was now the reason theirs were on the list. I was no longer the shadow in someone else's celebration. I was the headline. I didn't feel joy. Not yet. Recognition, when it comes after erasure, doesn't land like a reward. It lands like a question. Will they see you now, or just pretend they always did? I forwarded the email to Colonel Rhodes. He responded in 4 words. See you on the stage, no embellishment, just a fact, just respect. The ceremony was 2 weeks away. In that time, I trained like I had for missions, preparing for every possible variable, emotional and strategic. I practiced my brief remarks, short, clean, and unsentimental. I had no interest in giving the Emerson family a redemption arc. This wasn't their story. It was mine. I wasn't walking into that room hoping to be hugged. I was walking in because I had earned the right to stand there. On the morning of the anniversary, I stood before the mirror in my updated dress, Blues Major's insignia polished to a quiet gleam. My hair was pinned back, my shoulders squared. Ellie had mailed me a pin last week, an old family heirloom that had belonged to our grandmother and nurse during WTE. To remind you, her note read that legacy doesn't just follow, it begins. I fastened it inside my lapel, unseen but present, just like she had always been. The event hall was larger than the one from Nathan's promotion, but this time I didn't pause outside. I didn't need to rehearse confidence. I was the reason this event existed. As I entered aides in formal attire, directed attendees toward their sections. I moved past them without speaking, my boots silent on the marble floor. Every step was measured not stiff with nerves, but grounded by years of walking hallways where no one turned their head. Near the centre stage, I caught sight of the reserved seating placards. My name was etched into brass, Major Grace Emerson, Recon Command Lead. I reached down and touched it for a brief moment. My seat. No one could take it from me. Across the aisle, I saw them. Nathan in full uniform medals across his chest, like punctuation marks to a story only he had written. My father, still stoic, adjusting the sleeves of his blazer like he was preparing to be photographed. My mother, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes scanning the room for someone who looked familiar enough to offer comfort. They hadn't seen me yet. Good. Before I could react further, a junior officer approached. "Ma'am," he said, voice crisp, "you're being called backstage now." I nodded. As I followed him down the hall, I passed a series of screens showing historical footage, soldiers, field medics, storm-tossed helicopters. One monitor displayed a list of honorees again. My name first. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. My presence was no longer conditional. The coordinator backstage handed me a program and whispered, "You're third to speak after the General's keynote. You'll be introduced by title. Is there anything you'd like us to emphasize?" I paused. "Just the facts," I said, "and use my full title. All of it." She nodded. "Of course, General Grace Emerson." I froze. "Pardon?" I asked. She looked up. "Didn't they tell you your rank was finalized last night? The board moved to approve your elevation. You're officially on record. The General's going to announce it. There are moments when the world doesn't shift, it sharpens." My lungs drew in air like it was heavier than gravity. "Thank you," I whispered. Back in the wings, I waited. I could hear applause after each name was called. Laughter. The slow rhythm of respect fills the air like a tide. Then the voice echoed across the room. "Please rise as we welcome our final honoree to the stage, General Grace Emerson." And for the first time since I'd returned, I allowed myself to wonder, had I really made it back, or had I simply made peace with never needing to? Either way, I wasn't invisible anymore. The doors to the auditorium parted in slow ceremony, polished brass handles glinting under the weight of late afternoon sun. I stepped through them, not like someone invited, but like someone who finally stopped asking. The hallway smelled of old wood polish and something metallic, underneath the scent of history and ambition, pressed into carpet and concrete. I walked past the portraits of past honorees, each one frozen mid-salute or captured behind a podium, names etched into gold plates. My name had never been here. not even when I was at my best, not when I'd led the most critical ops, not when I'd been sacrificed to preserve someone else's ascent. But tonight was different. As I neared the entrance to the hall, the event coordinator, a young sergeant with bright eyes and trembling fingers, stiffened when she saw the insignia on my jacket. She flipped through her list quickly and then straightened, snapping into form. "Major," she paused, corrected herself. "General Emerson, we've been expecting you." "General." It echoed differently when spoken by someone who meant it. The doors opened. The room fell into silence, not staged, not ceremonial, but the kind that forms when something unspoken finally walks into the light. Heads turned, a few whispers, one audible intake of breath. The kind of hush that doesn't demand attention, but earns it. I walked down the aisle, slowly, boots steady back, straight. I wasn't performing. I wasn't pretending. I was arriving on my own terms. At the front, the MC adjusted the mic. The room waited. Then came the voice. "Please rise as we welcome our final honoree to the stage, General Grace Emerson." There was a heartbeat of nothing, and then applause. Not polite, not programmed, but erupting, spontaneous, electric, unstoppable. Chairs scraped, people rose, hands met with thunder, some gasped, a few shouted, cameras clicked like applause in their own language. I stepped onto the stage, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing for it. The spotlight hit me square in the chest. I reached for the mic, not trembling, not overwhelmed. Steady. I looked out into the crowd, past medals and ribbons, past polished shoes and press badges, past my mother's stunned face, my father's rigid posture, and Nathan's unreadable stare. And I said, voice clear, "Years ago, I stood outside a hall, told I wasn't on the list. Today, I stand here first." The words fell into the air like stone into still water. And the ripple was seismic. The crowd roared, not out of obligation, out of recognition. I waited for the silence to return. Not the silencing kind I'd grown up with, but the listening kind. And then I continued. I never fought for applause. I never fought for the ceremony. I fought to make sure my team came home. I fought to preserve what this uniform was meant to protect: truth, integrity, and the voices that don't always speak loudest. I paused. I didn't get here because I was louder than my brother. I got here because I refused to disappear. And to anyone out there who's been made to feel invisible, this moment is for you. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. My presence was the emotion. My voice was the closure. Another wave of applause. Then a moment of stillness. Behind me, the screen now bore my name. Full title. Full honours. No footnote. Not a single person sat down until I left the stage. And for once, there was no one else I would have rather been. My hand still held Ellie's letter, long after I had finished reading it. It had creased along the fold, soft from being held too tightly. There was something sacred in its simplicity. That day I stood. I didn't step forward. But now I'm learning how. That line echoed louder in my chest than all the applause I'd heard hours before. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my uniform over my heart and stepped outside into the cooling night. The air was crisp, the kind of crisp that signals change not in season, but in self. The parking lot was mostly empty now. Stray rappers danced in the wind. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed, unburdened, distant. I moved toward my car slowly, but not because I was tired. I just wanted to make this moment stretch, to memorize the feel of it. The quiet after vindication. The silence that no longer swallowed, but softened. Halfway across the lot, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. It was Nathan. He didn't speak right away. He stood under the halo of a streetlight, his dress shoes scuffing slightly on the concrete. He looked older tonight, not in age, but in understanding. "I watched your speech," he said. "I saw you didn't clap, I replied, not bitter, just honest. His jaw twitched. I did. Eventually. Silence stretched again, the kind that asked permission to go deeper. I didn't grant it, but I didn't walk away either. He took a breath. I didn't think it would matter that I took credit for that call. I thought you'd recover. You always do. I stared at him. You thought I'd survive being erased. Again. He didn't deny it. I stepped closer. Nathan, this wasn't about a mission. It was about the years before it, the moments at dinner tables, the missed birthdays, the report cards left unopened. It was about learning to disappear while you became the story. His eyes dropped. I'm not angry anymore, I said. But I am done explaining myself. He nodded. I deserve that. No, I corrected. You deserved the chance to do better. What you do with it now, that's on you. I turned to leave, and this time he didn't follow. Sometimes closure isn't a door slamming shut, it's choosing not to reopen it. Back in my apartment later that night, I peeled off my uniform slowly. Not with heaviness, but with reverence. I hung it neatly in the closet, not buried in the back like before, but scented, clean, ready. I poured a glass of water, sat on the floor, and opened a new journal. The first page was blank. I didn't start with a date or a rank. I started with a sentence. Today I stood inside a room that once shut me out, and no one could pretend I didn't belong. I wrote for hours, not about revenge, not about loss, about Ellie's letter, about the corporal I'd seen cry quietly behind the barracks, about the young recruits who now listened not because they had to, but because they trusted me. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. This was about planting something new. Weeks later, I'd be asked to mentor a leadership cohort of young officers. Most were women. One approached me after our first session and said, "You don't speak like the others. You speak like you've lost things." I smiled. That's because I have. And I'm still here. That became my quiet motto, I'm still here. The kind of mantra you don't shout, but wear like armour. That spring Ellie sent another letter. I've applied for officer candidate school, she wrote. I'm terrified, but when they asked me why I wanted to serve, I said, because someone once stood in silence so I could find my voice. I framed that letter, not out of vanity, but because it was proof that healing echoes louder than hurt when you give it space to grow. And on nights when the ghosts return, when I remember the night I stood outside that glass door and watched my family laugh without me, I remind myself I didn't just survive. I rebuilt. I didn't walk back into that hall to reclaim a seat. I walked in to build my own table. And now, if you're someone who's ever been left off, the list ignored in your own home, told your quiet wasn't good enough, pull up a chair. There's room here. And if you're ready, drop your story in the comments. I'll be here, listening, always.